The story of cocaine in England begins not on British soil, but in the cloud forests of the Andean highlands, where indigenous peoples had cultivated and revered the coca plant for thousands of years, before European conquest would transform this sacred leaf into one of the most consequential pharmaceutical and social phenomena in British history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The botanical foundations of England's cocaine history emerged from Erythroxylum coca, a hardy shrub native to the eastern slopes of the Andes Mountains, where it had flourished across territories that would later comprise Peru, Bolivia, Colombia, and Ecuador. Archaeological evidence recovered from burial sites throughout the Andean region demonstrates that indigenous populations had been cultivating and consuming coca leaves since at least 3,000 years before the Common Era, with mummified remains from coastal Peru showing evidence of coca consumption through the presence of coca alkaloids in hair samples and the inclusion of coca-chewing implements among grave goods. The Inca Empire, which reached its territorial zenith during the 15th century of the Common Era, had integrated coca consumption into the administrative, religious, and economic fabric of their civilization, with the leaf serving functions that ranged from sacred offerings in religious ceremonies to a form of currency that could be exchanged for labor services and a medicinal substance that priests and healers employed for treating various ailments. The Spanish conquistadors, who began their systematic conquest of the Inca territories in 1532, initially regarded indigenous coca consumption with suspicion and moral disapproval, viewing the practice through the interpretive frameworks of Catholic theology that categorized unfamiliar indigenous customs as potentially diabolical or heretical practices requiring suppression or careful regulation. Francisco Pizarro's chroniclers documented the widespread use of coca among indigenous populations, noting with a mixture of fascination and concern how laborers could work extended periods at high altitudes while consuming coca leaves, how religious practitioners incorporated the leaves into divination ceremonies, and how the substance appeared to provide energy and endurance that exceeded what the Spanish considered normal human capabilities without supernatural intervention. The initial Spanish response to coca cultivation and consumption reflected the complex and often contradictory nature of colonial administration, as authorities oscillated between attempts to suppress the practice as incompatible with Christian conversion efforts and pragmatic recognition that coca consumption enabled indigenous laborers to endure the brutal working conditions in towns. The silver mines of Potosi and other colonial extraction operations that generated the mineral wealth flowing to Spain. The Catholic Church's institutional position on coca evolved through successive pronouncements by colonial ecclesiastical authorities, with the Council of Lima in 1567 officially condemning coca as a pagan practice, while simultaneously acknowledging that complete suppression would be practically impossible given the substance's integration into its systems. Indigenous daily life and the colonial economy's dependence on indigenous labor, sustained partly through coca consumption. The economic imperatives of colonial exploitation ultimately prevailed over religious objections, as Spanish authorities recognized that the silver mines and agricultural haciendas that formed the foundation of colonial wealth required indigenous labor forces that depended on coca for sustaining their productivity under conditions that would otherwise have been physically unsustainable. The Spanish colonial administration established regulatory systems that controlled coca cultivation and distribution while generating tax revenue from the trade, creating monopolistic arrangements that channeled coca commerce through authorized merchants who paid licensing fees and customs duties to colonial treasuries. The botanical and pharmacological knowledge that would eventually enable cocaine's introduction to England remained largely confined to Spanish colonial territories for nearly 3 centuries after the conquest, as Spain maintained tight control over information regarding potentially valuable New World resources, and the broader European scientific community lacked direct access to Andean territories, where coca cultivation flourished. The first detailed botanical descriptions of the coca plant that reached scientific audiences beyond Spain appeared in the work of naturalists who accompanied Spanish expeditions or who gained access to colonial territories through official channels, with the French naturalist Joseph de Jussieu providing some of the earliest systematic botanical documentation during his travels through Peru between 1735 and 1741 as part of the French geodesic mission that had been authorized by Spanish authorities to conduct astronomical and geographical measurements along the equator. Jussieu's observations included detailed descriptions of coca's botanical characteristics, cultivation methods, and indigenous consumption practices, though his work remained largely unpublished during his lifetime, and thus had limited immediate impact on European scientific understanding of the plant. The scientific revolution's emphasis on systematic classification and empirical observation gradually created intellectual frameworks that would enable European naturalists to approach New World plants as subjects for botanical study, rather than merely as curiosities or potential economic resources, with Carl Linnaeus's binomial nomenclature system providing standardized methods for classifying and describing plant species from across the globe. The inclusion of coca in European botanical literature proceeded slowly and incompletely throughout the 18th century, as the practical difficulties of transporting viable plant specimens across vast oceanic distances meant that most European botanists worked from dried samples or written descriptions rather than living plants that would have enabled more comprehensive study of the species' characteristics and properties. The transmission of coca specimens and knowledge from South American territories to European scientific institutions accelerated during the late 18th and early 19th centuries as the Enlightenment's emphasis on natural history classification and the practical benefits of botanical knowledge for medicine and agriculture stimulated increased European interest in cataloguing and understanding New World plant species. The Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, established in 1759 and expanded significantly during the directorship of Sir Joseph Banks beginning in 1773, became a crucial node in the global networks through which botanical specimens and information flowed between European colonial territories and metropolitan scientific institutions. Banks, who had accompanied James Cook's first Pacific voyage between 1768 and 1771 and had established himself as one of Britain's most influential scientific figures, promoted the systematic collection and study of economically useful plants from across the expanding British Empire, while maintaining correspondence networks with botanists and collectors working in territories controlled by other European powers. The broader context of European botanical imperialism during this period reflected the recognition that control over valuable plant species and the knowledge necessary for their cultivation could provide significant economic and strategic advantages, with European powers investing substantial resources in establishing botanical gardens, funding collection expeditions, and developing techniques for transporting living plants across long distances. The Wardian case, invented by Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward in 1829, revolutionized the transportation of living plants by creating sealed glass containers that maintained stable humidity levels and protected specimens from salt spray during oceanic voyages, dramatically increasing the survival rates for plants being transferred between continents and enabling the successful establishment of economically important species in new geographical locations. The application of Wardian case technology to coca transportation during the 1830s enabled European botanical gardens to receive living coca plants for the first time, creating opportunities for systematic botanical study and experimental cultivation that had previously been impossible when European scientists could only examine dried leaf samples. The first successful cultivation of coca plants at European botanical institutions occurred at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris during the 1830s, where botanists working under the direction of Achille Richard succeeded in growing specimens that had been transported from South America. Though these early cultivation efforts remained primarily focused on botanical classification and description rather than chemical analysis of the plant's active constituents. The scientific investigation of coca's physiological effects proceeded through multiple approaches during the early 19th century, including descriptive accounts by European travelers and medical practitioners working in South America. experimental trials conducted on European volunteers, and ultimately chemical analyses aimed at isolating and identifying the specific compounds responsible for coca's observed effects on human energy, endurance, and perception. The earliest European medical interest in coca focused primarily on understanding the mechanisms through which indigenous South Americans achieved the remarkable physical endurance that Spanish colonial observers had documented for centuries, with European physicians and natural philosophers seeking to determine whether coca's effects resulted from nutritional properties, stimulant actions similar to coffee or tea, or entirely novel pharmacological mechanisms. Paolo Mantegazza, an Italian neurologist and physiologist who lived in Argentina between 1854 and 1858, conducted some of the first systematic European medical investigations of coca's effects through self-experimentation that he documented in his 1859 publication Sulle virtù igienische e medicinali della coca e sugli alimenti nervosi in generale, which translates as On the Hygienic and Medicinal Properties of Coca and on Nervous Foods in General. Mantegazza's enthusiastic descriptions of coca's ability to enhance physical and mental performance, combined with his suggestions regarding potential therapeutic applications, ranging from digestive disorders to melancholy, helped stimulate broader European medical interest in the substance while establishing narrative frameworks that emphasized coca's beneficial properties and minimized or overlooked potential adverse effects. The chemical isolation of cocaine from coca leaves represented a crucial transformation that would fundamentally alter the substance's relationship to British society, as the concentration of coca's active alkaloid into a pure chemical compound created possibilities for standardized medical dosing, pharmaceutical manufacturing, and modes of administration that differed dramatically from traditional coca leaf chewing. Albert Niemann, a German graduate student working in the laboratory of Friedrich Wöhler at the University of Göttingen, achieved the first successful isolation of relatively pure cocaine in 1859 through a process that involved treating coca leaves with alkaline solutions, extracting the resulting free-base alkaloids with organic solvents, and crystallizing the purified cocaine compound. Niemann's doctoral dissertation, describing the isolation process and cocaine's basic chemical properties, provided the foundational knowledge that would enable subsequent researchers to study the alkaloid's pharmacological effects and pharmaceutical manufacturers to produce standardized cocaine preparations. The molecular structure of cocaine, which would not be fully elucidated until Richard Willstetter's work in 1898, consists of a complex arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen atoms that creates a molecule capable of interacting with multiple biological systems, including the nervous system mechanisms that regulate pleasure, reward, attention, and motor control. The pharmacological effects of pure cocaine differed significantly in intensity and onset, from the more gradual and sustained effects produced by traditional coca leaf consumption, as the alkaloid concentration in pure cocaine exceeded by many times the amounts that indigenous users would have absorbed through chewing leaves mixed with alkaline substances, while new routes of administration, including injection and nasal insufflation, enabled rapid delivery of high cocaine concentrations to the brain and other organs. The introduction of cocaine to British medical practice occurred within the broader context of Victorian pharmaceutical innovation and the widespread medical use of psychoactive substances that included opium, morphine, cannabis, and numerous other plant-derived compounds, whose regulation remained minimal throughout most of the 19th century. British pharmaceutical manufacturers began producing cocaine preparations during the 1870s and 1880s, as German chemical research demonstrating the alkaloid's anesthetic properties and stimulant effects reached English-speaking medical audiences through translation and republication in British medical journals. The firm of Merck in Darmstadt, Germany, which had evolved from a 17th century pharmacy into a major pharmaceutical manufacturer, began commercial cocaine production in 1862 and quickly became the dominant global supplier of pharmaceutical cocaine, exporting the substance to Britain and other countries, where demand grew rapidly following published reports of cocaine's medical applications. British pharmaceutical companies, including Burroughs Wellcome and Company, founded in 1880 by American pharmacists Silas Burroughs and Henry Wellcome, began manufacturing their own cocaine products during the 1880s, while also importing bulk cocaine from German suppliers for formulation into various proprietary medicines and pharmaceutical preparations. The medical applications that British physicians explored for cocaine during the 1870s and 1880s reflected the substance's observed effects on nervous system function, with early therapeutic uses focusing primarily on three areas: as a local anesthetic for surgical procedures, as a stimulant for treating depression and fatigue, and as a treatment for opiate and alcohol addiction, based on the theory that cocaine could help patients overcome dependence on these other substances. The revolutionary application of cocaine as a local anesthetic emerged from the research of Karl Koller, an Austrian ophthalmologist who discovered in 1884 that cocaine solutions applied to the surface of the eye produce sufficient numbness to permit surgical procedures without general anesthesia or the physical restraint of conscious patients. Koller's findings, presented at the Ophthalmological Congress in Heidelberg in September of 1884, spread rapidly through international medical networks as surgeons recognized the transformative potential of local anesthesia for procedures that had previously required general anesthesia with its associated risks or had to be performed on conscious patients experiencing severe pain. British surgeons and physicians quickly adopted cocaine as a local anesthetic for eye surgery, dental procedures, and various minor surgical operations, with medical journals publishing numerous reports documenting successful applications and discussing optimal techniques for cocaine administration in different surgical contexts. The firm of John Bell and Company in London began marketing cocaine hydrochloride specifically for surgical anesthesia within months of Koller's announcement, advertising the product to medical practitioners through promotional materials that emphasized its effectiveness and reliability while making no mention of potential adverse effects or risks of dependence. The broader medical enthusiasm for cocaine during the mid-1880s extended far beyond its anesthetic applications to encompass a wide range of therapeutic uses that reflected Victorian medical theories about the causes and treatment of nervous disorders, fatigue, and various chronic conditions. Sigmund Freud's 1884 essay, Über Coca, translated into English as On Coca, promoted cocaine as a treatment for depression, digestive disorders, morphine addiction, alcoholism, and sexual dysfunction, with Freud's enthusiastic endorsement carrying significant weight among medical practitioners due to his emerging reputation as a neurological researcher, even before his later development of psychoanalytic theory. Freud's own experiences with cocaine, which he consumed regularly during the mid-1880s and recommended to friends, colleagues, and patients, exemplified the casual and optimistic approach that characterized early medical attitudes toward the substance. As physicians who had witnessed the devastating effects of unregulated opium and morphine use somehow failed to anticipate that cocaine might pose similar risks of dependence and adverse health effects. The medical literature published in British journals during the 1880s contained numerous case reports and clinical observations describing successful cocaine treatment of conditions ranging from hay fever and seasickness, tuberculosis, and menstrual disorders, with many authors expressing unreserved enthusiasm about the substance's therapeutic potential, while dismissing or minimizing adverse effects as idiosyncratic reactions occurring only in particularly sensitive individuals or resulting from improper administration techniques. The pharmaceutical formulations through which British patients consumed cocaine during this period ranged from pure cocaine hydrochloride solutions used for injection or topical application to proprietary medicines that combined cocaine with other active ingredients, including alcohol, caffeine, cannabis extracts, and various herbal components, with manufacturers creating specialized products marketed for specific conditions or demographic groups. The distinction between prescription medications and over-the-counter preparations remained vague throughout much of the Victorian period, as British pharmaceutical regulation did not yet require formal demonstration of safety or efficacy before products could be marketed to consumers. and physicians' prescriptions served more as recommendations from trusted authorities than as legal prerequisites for obtaining particular medicines. The ready availability of cocaine through multiple commercial channels meant that British consumers could obtain the substance through prescriptions from physicians, direct purchase from pharmacists, who might or might not inquire about the intended use, mail order from pharmaceutical supply companies that advertised in popular magazines and newspapers, and inclusion as an ingredient in numerous patent medicines that could be purchased without any medical consultation or specialized knowledge about their contents. The absence of accurate product labeling requirements meant that many British consumers who used patent medicines containing cocaine remained unaware of the substance's presence in products they purchased for treating common ailments, as manufacturers were not legally required to disclose ingredient lists and often deliberately obscured the composition of proprietary formulations to prevent competitors from duplicating their products. The social context within which cocaine entered British commercial and medical markets during the 1880s was characterized by relatively permissive attitudes towards psychoactive substance use, combined with increasing concerns about alcohol abuse and growing support for temperance movements that sought to reduce or eliminate drinking through moral suasion, legal restrictions, or the promotion of alternative beverages and medicines. The temperance movement's emphasis on finding substitutes for alcoholic beverages created market opportunities for products containing cocaine and other stimulants that manufacturers marketed as healthier alternatives to alcohol, with advertising copy often explicitly emphasizing how these products could provide energy and mental clarity without alcohol's inebriating effects or the moral degradation that temperance advocates associated with drinking. The most famous cocaine-containing beverage to achieve commercial success during this period was Vin Mariani, created by Angelo Mariani in France in 1863 and subsequently distributed in Britain and throughout Europe, which combined Bordeaux wine with coca leaf extract to produce a preparation that Mariani marketed as a tonic capable of restoring health, enhancing vitality, and improving mental and physical performance. Vin Mariani achieved remarkable commercial success and cultural prominence during the late 19th century, with testimonials from satisfied consumers, including Pope Leo XIII, Queen Victoria, Thomas Edison, Jules Verne, and numerous other prominent figures whose endorsements Mariani prominently featured in advertising materials that circulated widely in Britain and other European markets. The advertising strategies employed for Vin Mariani and similar cocaine-containing products during this period reflected sophisticated understanding of emerging mass marketing techniques, with manufacturers creating elaborate promotional campaigns that combined celebrity endorsements, medical testimonials, appealing visual designs, and carefully crafted copy that emphasized products' benefits while avoiding mention of potential risks or adverse effects that might discourage purchases. The pharmaceutical infrastructure supporting cocaine's proliferation in late Victorian Britain included an expanding network of chemical manufacturers, wholesale drug suppliers, retail pharmacies, and mail-order businesses that collectively created distribution systems capable of delivering the substance to consumers throughout the country, regardless of their geographical location or social class. The growth of industrial-scale pharmaceutical manufacturing during the second half of the 19th century enabled British companies to produce cocaine-containing medicines in standardized formulations and increasingly large quantities, with mechanized production processes replacing traditional handcraft pharmacy methods and creating economies of scale that reduced prices and made cocaine products accessible to working-class consumers who could not afford the higher prices charged by traditional chemists for individually compounded preparations. The retail pharmacy sector underwent significant expansion during the Victorian period, as increasing numbers of qualified chemists established shops in urban centres and provincial towns, creating dense networks of outlets where consumers could obtain medicines without necessarily consulting physicians, though the relationships between pharmacists and their regular customers often involved informal consultations that served functions similar to medical advice. The professional status and self-regulation of British pharmacists during this period remained somewhat ambiguous, as the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain, established in 1841, provided voluntary professional organization and educational standardization, but lacked legal authority to prevent individuals without formal training from selling medicines until passage of the Pharmacy Act of 1868, created registration requirements for practicing pharmacists. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 represented the first significant attempt to regulate medicine sales in Britain through professional credentialing requirements, though the legislation's limited scope meant that it primarily affected who could legally call themselves pharmacists, rather than imposing comprehensive restrictions on which substances could be sold or under what conditions they could be distributed. The Act's Schedule of Poisons, which listed substances subject to sale restrictions, including arsenic, strychnine, and various other toxic compounds, notably omitted cocaine and most other psychoactive drugs, despite growing awareness within medical circles that these substances could produce adverse effects when used inappropriately or excessively. The legislative framework governing cocaine during the 1870s and 1880s thus permitted essentially unrestricted sale and use, with the substance occupying a similar legal status to caffeine, alcohol, or numerous other psychoactive compounds whose consumption British law did not attempt to prohibit or regulate through criminal sanctions. The broader British regulatory philosophy during this period emphasized freedom of commerce and individual liberty over state intervention in personal health decisions, reflecting Victorian liberal ideology that generally opposed government restrictions on business activities or consumer choices, except in cases where clear evidence of harm to third parties could be demonstrated. The practical consequences of this minimally regulated environment included both the rapid dissemination of potentially beneficial medical innovations like local anesthesia and the equally rapid spread of problematic consumption patterns, as individuals discovered cocaine's euphoric and energizing effects and began using the substance for non-medical purposes, without understanding the potential for dependence or adverse health consequences. The medical profession's initial optimism about cocaine began to erode during the late 1880s, as physicians observed growing numbers of patients experiencing adverse effects, including anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and compulsive use patterns that interfered with normal, social, and occupational functioning, leading to the publication of case reports and clinical observations that questioned earlier enthusiastic assessments of cocaine's safety and therapeutic value. The gradual recognition of cocaine's risks proceeded unevenly across different segments of British medical opinion, with some practitioners maintaining that problems arose primarily from improper use or excessive dosing, while others began arguing for more cautious approaches that restricted cocaine administration to specific medical applications where its benefits clearly outweighed potential harms. The emerging medical concerns about cocaine during the 1890s coincided with broader social anxieties about drug use, moral degeneracy, and threats to British society posed by various forms of vice and excess that characterized late Victorian reform movements. The social purity movement, which gained prominence during the 1880s and 1890s, promoted campaigns against prostitution, pornography, and other activities that reformers characterized as morally corrupting, while also increasingly focusing attention on alcohol and drug use as threats to individual health, family stability, and national strength. The temperance movement's long-standing opposition to alcohol consumption began to extend during this period toward other intoxicating substances, as reformers recognized that their arguments about alcohol's harmful effects could be applied with equal or greater force to drugs like opium, morphine, and cocaine that produced even more powerful psychoactive effects. The international dimensions of drug control efforts began to emerge during the late 19th century, as European imperial powers recognized that opium trafficking in Asian colonies posed both economic and political challenges that required coordinated responses transcending individual national jurisdictions. The British government's involvement in the opium trade through the Government of India's monopoly on opium production and export to China created complex contradictions between economic interests that benefited from the drug, trade, and moral reform movements that condemned the social and health effects of opium consumption. The Shanghai Opium Commission of 1909, convened at American initiative with British participation, represented the first major international conference focused on drug control issues, though its recommendations remained non-binding and implementation relied entirely on voluntary cooperation by participating governments. The Hague International Opium Convention of 1912, which followed from the Shanghai Commission's work, established the first international treaty framework for drug control by requiring signatory nations to implement domestic legislation, regulating the production, distribution, and use of opium, morphine, and cocaine, though the convention's enforcement mechanisms remained weak, and many countries delayed ratification or implementation of required legislative changes. The British government's ratification of the Hague Convention required the passage of domestic legislation implementing treaty obligations, leading to the preparation of what would become the Defence of the Realm Act regulations during the First World War, and ultimately the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 that established the modern British framework for drug control. The immediate practical impact of international drug control agreements on cocaine availability in Britain remained limited during the 1910s, as domestic legislation had not yet been enacted, and the traditional systems of pharmaceutical distribution and medical prescription continued to operate much as they had during the previous decades. The outbreak of the First World War in August of 1914 created new pressures for drug control, as military and civilian authorities became concerned about cocaine and opium use among soldiers and defense workers, leading to emergency regulations under the Defence of the Realm Act that imposed the first significant legal restrictions on cocaine distribution in Britain. Regulation 40B, implemented under the Defence of the Realm Act in 1916, prohibited the unauthorized possession and sale of cocaine and opium to members of His Majesty's Armed Forces, reflecting official concerns that drug use undermined military discipline and combat effectiveness, even though evidence for widespread cocaine use among British soldiers remained largely anecdotal rather than based on systematic investigation. The wartime regulations represented a significant departure from earlier approaches to drug policy by establishing criminal penalties for cocaine possession and creating enforcement responsibilities for police forces that had not previously been involved in regulating access to pharmaceutical products. The social contexts within which British cocaine use occurred during the Edwardian period and First World War years included both continuing medical applications that followed 19th century patterns and emerging recreational use, concentrated in particular urban subcultures and social networks. The West End, theatrical and artistic communities in London, developed reputations as centres of cocaine use during the 1910s, with contemporary accounts describing drug consumption at parties and social gatherings attended by actors, musicians, and various bohemian figures whose lifestyles challenged conventional Victorian moral standards. The association between cocaine use and theatrical performers reflected several factors, including the demanding performance schedules that created desire for stimulants that could sustain energy through multiple shows, the social networks within entertainment industries that facilitated drug distribution through informal sharing and commercial sale, and the cultural attitudes within artistic communities that viewed drug experimentation as sophisticated or avant-garde rather than morally problematic. The intersection of cocaine use with prostitution in London's West End created particular concerns for moral reformers and police officials who viewed drug consumption as both cause and consequence of women's involvement in sex work, with reformers arguing that cocaine use undermined women's moral resistance to prostitution, while also claiming that prostitutes introduced clients to drug use as part of their business activities. The racialized dimensions of British drug discourse during this period included recurring associations between cocaine use and Chinese, black, and other non-white populations in British port cities, with newspaper accounts and official reports frequently characterizing drug trafficking as an activity dominated by foreign criminal networks that threatened to corrupt white British populations. The construction of cocaine as a foreign threat introduced by alien populations reflected broader xenophobic currents in early 20th century British society, while also serving rhetorical functions in debates over drug policy by enabling reformers to present control measures as necessary for protecting British racial and national integrity against external corruption. The media coverage of cocaine during the First World War period included sensationalized accounts of drug use by soldiers on leave in London and other cities, with newspaper stories often combining prurient details about West End nightlife with moralistic condemnation of both drug dealers who supplied cocaine to servicemen and the women who allegedly introduced soldiers to drug use through sexual relationships. The death of Billy Carlton, a West End actress who died from drug intoxication in November of 1918, shortly after attending a victory ball celebrating the armistice, generated extensive newspaper coverage and public debate about drug use in theatrical circles, with the subsequent trial of Reggie DeVole and Ada Ping-yu on charges related to supplying drugs to Carlton, becoming a media sensation that influenced public opinion about the need for stricter drug control measures. The Carlton case exemplified how individual tragedies involving prominent figures could catalyze policy changes by creating moral panic about drug use that overwhelmed more measured assessments of the actual prevalence and social distribution of cocaine consumption in Britain. The legislative response to wartime concerns about cocaine culminated in the passage of the Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920, which implemented Britain's obligations under the Hague International Opium Convention by establishing comprehensive controls over the import, export, manufacture, sale, and possession of cocaine, opium, morphine, and their derivatives. The Dangerous Drugs Act created a new regulatory framework that required physicians to maintain records of cocaine prescriptions, restricted cocaine sales to licensed pharmacists operating on valid prescriptions, and established criminal penalties, including imprisonment for unauthorized possession or distribution of controlled drugs. The Home Office received responsibility for administering the Dangerous Drugs Act and coordinating enforcement efforts, creating bureaucratic structures and expertise in drug policy that would shape British approaches to controlled substances throughout the 20th century. The implementation of the Dangerous Drugs Act during the early 1920s proceeded gradually as the Home Office developed administrative systems, trained enforcement personnel, and established working relationships with medical and pharmaceutical organizations, whose cooperation would be essential for effective regulation. The impact of the Dangerous Drugs Act on cocaine availability and consumption patterns in Britain during the 1920s reflected both the legislation's restrictive provisions and the practical limitations of enforcement. Efforts that struggled to control black market distribution networks operating outside legal channels. The medical use of cocaine declined significantly during the 1920s and 1930s, as physicians became more aware of the substance's risks and as alternative local anesthetics, including procaine and novocaine, which offered similar anesthetic effects without cocaine's systemic stimulant actions and addictive properties, became available for clinical use. The pharmaceutical industry's development of synthetic local anesthetics represented a crucial technological change that reduced legitimate medical demand for cocaine, while simultaneously enabling physicians to achieve the therapeutic benefits that had originally made cocaine valuable for surgical and dental procedures. The restriction of legal cocaine supplies to medical and scientific uses created economic incentives for black market trafficking, as individuals seeking the drug for non-medical purposes could no longer obtain it through legitimate pharmaceutical channels, and thus turned to criminal distribution networks that sourced cocaine through smuggling, theft from medical facilities, or illicit manufacture. The international cocaine trade during the interwar period involved complex smuggling routes that moved the drug from manufacturing centers in Europe and South America to consumer markets in Britain and other countries, with criminal organizations exploiting gaps in international enforcement, cooperation, and the difficulty of monitoring all potential transportation routes across borders and through ports. The Home Office attempts to track and interdict cocaine smuggling during the 1920s and 1930s faced substantial challenges due to limited personnel, inadequate international intelligence sharing, and the reality that cocaine's high value relative to its bulk made it economically attractive for smugglers, even when enforcement efforts succeeded in seizing substantial quantities. The cocaine consumption that persisted in Britain during the interwar period concentrated increasingly in urban areas and in social contexts, characterized by transgressive behavior, including illegal gambling, prostitution, and and various forms of underground nightlife that operated outside conventional social regulation. The association between cocaine use and London's Soho district became particularly prominent during this period, with the neighbourhood's concentration of nightclubs, jazz clubs, and other entertainment venues, creating social environments where drug use could occur with relative privacy, despite police monitoring and periodic enforcement crackdowns. The cultural dimensions of cocaine use during the interwar period reflected the substance's association with modernity, jazz music, African American cultural influences, and various forms of social experimentation that challenged traditional British moral standards, with drug consumption functioning partly as a marker of participation in cosmopolitan urban culture that rejected Victorian respectability. The racialized elements of British drug discourse intensified during the 1920s and 1930s, as official reports and media accounts frequently characterized cocaine trafficking as an activity dominated by Chinese, West African, and Caribbean individuals whose presence in British cities allegedly threatened to corrupt white British populations through the dissemination of drugs and other vices. The deportation of foreign nationals convicted of drug offences became a standard practice during this period, with Home Office policies explicitly using immigration control as a drug enforcement tool by removing non-British traffickers from the country after they completed prison sentences for drug-related crimes. The gendered dimensions of cocaine discourse during the interwar period continued patterns established during the First World War by depicting women who used cocaine as victims of male dealers or as dangerous figures who introduced men to drug use through sexual relationships, with both characterizations serving to reinforce traditional gender roles, while also providing rationales for paternalistic interventions targeting women drug users. The Second World War period from 1939 through 1945 brought renewed attention to cocaine and other drugs as potential threats to military effectiveness and home front morale, though cocaine use appears to have been less prevalent during the Second World War than during the First World War due to more effective controls over pharmaceutical distribution and reduced cocaine availability resulting from wartime disruption of international trade routes. The emergency powers granted to the government under wartime regulations enabled authorities to impose additional restrictions on controlled substances beyond those provided in the Dangerous Drugs Act, including enhanced penalties for drug offences and expanded police search and seizure authorities. The wartime emphasis on national unity and shared sacrifice created social contexts that discouraged drug use as unpatriotic behavior that diverted resources from the war effort and undermined the collective discipline necessary for time prevailing against Nazi Germany. The immediate post-war period, during the late 1940s, witnessed significant changes in British society, including the establishment of the National Health Service in 1948, which fundamentally altered the organisation and financing of medical care, while creating new regulatory frameworks for pharmaceutical distribution that affected controlled substance access. The National Health Service's pharmaceutical benefits system, which provided medications to patients without direct charge at the point of service, created new channels through which individuals could potentially obtain prescription drugs, including controlled substances, by consulting multiple physicians or by convincing doctors to prescribe drugs for inappropriate purposes. The broader social and cultural changes that transformed Britain during the 1950s and 1960s included increasing affluence among younger generations, the emergence of youth subcultures centered on popular music, growing challenges to traditional moral and social authorities, and increasing contact with American cultural influences, including drug use patterns that differed from traditional British practices. The Beat Generation and subsequent countercultural movements that emerged in the United States during the 1950s influenced British youth culture through literature, music, and personal contacts, with American writers and musicians who experimented with various drugs, including marijuana, amphetamines, and later LSD, creating cultural frameworks that presented drug use as expressions of artistic creativity, spiritual seeking, or political resistance to mainstream society. The introduction of amphetamines to Britain during the interwar period and their widespread medical use during the 1940s and 1950s created the first major post-war drug problem, as physicians prescribed amphetamines liberally for weight loss, depression, and fatigue, while underground markets distributed pharmaceutical amphetamines to students seeking study aids and to youth subcultures, including mods who used the drugs to sustain extended periods of dancing and socializing at clubs and parties. The amphetamine crisis of the 1960s, which saw dramatic increases in non-medical use, particularly among young people, prompted regulatory responses that presaged later approaches to cocaine control, including restrictions on prescribing, monitoring of pharmaceutical distribution, and criminal penalties for unauthorized possession. The cannabis debate that emerged in Britain during the mid-1960s reflected broader cultural conflicts between traditionalist and modernizing tendencies as middle-class youth, students, and countercultural figures increasingly experimented with marijuana despite its illegality, leading to arrests of prominent musicians and public intellectuals whose prosecutions generated debate about the proportionality of drug laws and the appropriate relationship between individual liberty and state regulation of private behavior. The Wooten Report, commissioned by the Home Office and published in 1968, recommended reducing penalties for cannabis possession while maintaining prohibition, reflecting official recognition that existing laws treated cannabis use more severely than evidence about its harms warranted, though the government rejected many of the committee's proposals due to political considerations, including international treaty obligations and concerns about appearing soft on drugs. The cocaine situation in Britain during the 1950s and 1960s remained relatively stable, with low prevalence and limited distribution networks, as the drug had not yet been incorporated into youth culture or countercultural movements that were introducing marijuana and later LSD to broader populations. The emergence of cocaine as a significant drug problem in Britain occurred during the 1970s and accelerated dramatically during the 1980s as changes in international drug markets, cultural attitudes toward drug use, and the socio-economic conditions affecting British cities created environments conducive to cocaine trafficking and consumption. The international cocaine trade underwent massive expansion during the 1970s as Colombian trafficking organizations established sophisticated production and distribution networks that moved cocaine from South American manufacturing centers to consumer markets in the United States and Europe, with Colombian groups gradually displacing earlier traffickers from other countries to dominate the global cocaine business. The rise of the Medellin and Cali cartels during the 1970s and 1980s created criminal organizations with unprecedented resources, global reach, and willingness to use extreme violence to protect their operations. With these groups developing innovative smuggling techniques, corrupting government officials, and operating with sufficient sophistication to move multi-ton cocaine shipments across international borders despite enforcement efforts. The geographical position of Spain as a gateway to European cocaine markets meant that British criminal organizations often obtained cocaine through connections with Spanish traffickers who imported the drug from South America through maritime and air routes, with cocaine then moving from Spain to Britain through various means, including commercial shipping, private aircraft, individual couriers carrying concealed quantities, and postal shipments. The cocaine that reached British markets during the 1970s and early 1980s was typically cocaine hydrochloride powder that users consumed through nasal insufflation, with this route of administration producing effects that began within minutes and lasted 1 to 2 hours, creating patterns of repeated dosing as users sought to maintain or recreate the drug's euphoric and energizing effects. The purity of cocaine available in British street markets varied considerably depending on distribution network efficiency and the extent of adulteration by dealers who mixed cocaine with various cutting agents including sugars, local anesthetics like lidocaine, and stimulants like amphetamine or caffeine to increase profit margins by selling less cocaine per unit, while maintaining some of the expected effects. The consumer demographics for cocaine during the early stages of its emergence in Britain during the 1970s and early 1980s skewed toward affluent professionals and entertainment industry figures who could afford the drug's relatively high prices, which during this period often exceeded £100 per gram in London markets, making cocaine economically inaccessible to most working-class users who might seek stimulant effects from cheaper alternatives like amphetamine. The cultural associations between cocaine and wealth, success, and sophisticated urban lifestyles emerged during this period, partly as a result of the drug's high prices, and partly through its depiction in American films, music, and popular culture that portrayed cocaine use as glamorous and associated with elite social contexts. The 1980s witnessed a dramatic expansion of cocaine markets in Britain as increasing supply from South American producers reduced prices, while rising consumer demand encouraged criminal organizations to invest in distribution, infrastructure that could supply cocaine to broader geographical areas and more diverse customer populations. The election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in 1979 initiated a period of significant economic and social change that created conditions particularly conducive to drug market expansion, as policies promoting free markets and reducing state intervention combined with industrial decline to create growing socio-economic inequality, urban poverty, and youth unemployment that created both demand for drugs and opportunities for participation in drug distribution as an alternative to legitimate employment. The deindustrialization of British manufacturing during the 1980s caused particularly severe economic distress in northern cities, the Midlands, and South Wales, where factory closures and coal mine shutdowns eliminated employment opportunities for entire communities, while government policies provided limited support for economic transition or assistance to displaced workers. The crack cocaine epidemic that devastated many American cities during the mid-1980s began to affect Britain during the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the smokable form of cocaine that drug dealers produced by cooking cocaine, hydrochloride with baking soda, or ammonia to create cocaine base rocks found its way into British markets, where dealers recognized its potential for creating panned, intensive consumption patterns and customer dependence. Crack cocaine's pharmacological properties differed significantly from cocaine powder in terms of onset speed, intensity, and duration of effects, as smoking the drug delivered it to the brain within seconds through absorption in the lungs, producing an extremely intense but brief euphoria that left users craving additional doses within minutes of the initial high dissipating. The addictive potential of crack cocaine exceeded that of powder cocaine due to this rapid onset and brief duration combination that created powerful conditioning effects and compulsive use patterns, with users often engaging in binge consumption sessions involving repeated smoking at intervals of 15 to 30 minutes until their drug supplies or financial resources were exhausted. The social contexts of crack use differed markedly from the relatively discreet cocaine powder snorting that occurred in private residences or upscale venues, as crack dealing and use concentrated in open-air drug markets, crack houses where dealers allowed users to smoke their purchases on premises in exchange for fees, and public spaces where users without private locations consumed crack, despite police surveillance and social opprobrium. The association of crack cocaine with urban poverty, homelessness, prostitution, and property crime created intense stigmatization that exceeded the negative social judgments directed at powder cocaine users, with crack users often characterized in media coverage and political discourse as degraded figures beyond redemption, rather than as individuals suffering from health problems amenable to treatment. The racial dimensions of British crack cocaine discourse during the late 1980s and 1990s reproduced patterns established in earlier drug panics by disproportionately associating crack with Caribbean and African populations, despite evidence that white British drug users also participated in crack markets, with this racialization serving to intensify moral panic while also deflecting attention from the socio-economic conditions that created vulnerability to addiction across racial groups. The violence associated with crack cocaine markets resulted partly from the intensive competition for territorial control in lucrative urban dealing locations, and partly from the pharmacological effects of chronic crack use, including paranoia, aggression, and impaired judgment that sometimes precipitated interpersonal conflicts with violent outcomes. The broader cocaine markets in Britain during the 1980s and 1990s included both crack cocaine, concentrated in disadvantaged urban areas, and powder cocaine that continued to circulate primarily among middle-class users in professional and entertainment contexts, with these parallel markets operating through largely separate distribution networks, despite originating from the same imported cocaine supplies. The economic structure of cocaine distribution in Britain developed hierarchical arrangements with upper-level wholesalers importing multi-kilogram quantities from source countries or European transshipment points, mid-level dealers purchasing kilogram quantities for subdivision and distribution to street-level sellers, and retail dealers selling gram quantities to consumers while often cutting the cocaine to increase profits. The street value of cocaine in British markets fluctuated during this period, based on enforcement pressure, changes in international supply, and varying local market conditions, but generally trended downward in inflation-adjusted terms as increasing supply overwhelmed enforcement efforts to restrict availability. The profits available from cocaine trafficking created powerful economic incentives that attracted participants ranging from organized criminal groups with sophisticated international connections to opportunistic individual dealers engaged in small-scale distribution to support their own drug use or to supplement legitimate incomes in contexts of limited employment opportunities. The law enforcement response to cocaine trafficking during the 1980s and 1990s involved multiple agencies, including police forces responsible for street-level enforcement, customs officers monitoring ports and borders for drug smuggling, and specialized units like the National Crime Squad that investigated major trafficking organizations and coordinated complex investigations across jurisdictional boundaries. The Drug Trafficking Offences Act of 1986 and subsequent legislation strengthened enforcement tools by establishing asset forfeiture provisions that allowed authorities to seize property derived from drug trafficking, creating powerful sanctions that threatened traffickers' accumulated wealth, while also generating revenue that could fund further enforcement activities. The treatment capacity for cocaine and crack dependence remained severely inadequate throughout the 1980s and much of the 1990s, as the British health system had limited expertise in addressing stimulant addiction and treatment. Providers focused primarily on opiate dependence, which constituted the majority of problematic drug use, seeking clinical intervention. The harm reduction approaches that gained prominence in British drug policy during the 1980s in response to HIV, risks associated with injection drug use, focused primarily on heroin users, and did not develop specialized interventions addressing the distinct patterns of cocaine and crack use, though some harm reduction principles, including non-judgmental engagement with users and pragmatic focus on reducing negative consequences rather than demanding abstinence, could be applied to stimulant users. The evolution of British cocaine policy during the 1990s reflected ongoing tensions between punitive enforcement approaches, emphasizing criminal justice interventions and public health perspectives, prioritizing treatment and harm reduction. With these competing frameworks often operating simultaneously through different institutional channels, despite their conflicting assumptions about the nature of drug problems and appropriate responses. The election of Tony Blair's new Labour government in 1997 brought renewed attention to drug policy through initiatives including the appointment of a drug czar position and the development of comprehensive national drug strategies. Though these efforts maintained emphasis on enforcement and criminal justice responses, while incorporating expanded treatment, funding, and rhetoric about evidence-based policy. The creation of the UK Anti-Drugs Coordination Unit in 1998 and its subsequent evolution into the Drug Strategy Directorate reflected New Labour's managerialist approach to social problems through centralised coordination, performance measurement, and integration of health and criminal justice responses under unified strategic frameworks. The national drug strategies published in 1998 and updated subsequently established quantified targets for reducing drug use, drug-related crime, and drug availability, while increasing treatment access. Though the emphasis on measurable outcomes, sometimes created perverse incentives that encouraged agencies to focus on easily quantifiable activities rather than potentially more effective interventions that resisted simple measurement. The cocaine situation in Britain during the late 1990s and early 2000s underwent significant changes as powder cocaine use expanded beyond the affluent professional populations that had dominated consumption during earlier periods to encompass broader segments of the population, including recreational drug users in nightclub and festival contexts, where cocaine became increasingly normalized as a party drug used alongside alcohol, MDMA, and other substances. The normalization thesis advanced by sociologists studying British youth drug use during this period argued that certain drugs, including cannabis and cocaine, had become sufficiently common among young adults that their use no longer marked individuals as deviant or marginal, but rather represented unremarkable lifestyle choices that many people made without experiencing significant social consequences or identification as drug users. The growth of recreational cocaine use occurred particularly within nighttime economy contexts, as British cities invested heavily in developing entertainment districts, featuring bars, clubs, and restaurants designed to attract young professional workers with disposable income, creating social environments where cocaine use became embedded in patterns of conspicuous consumption, status display, and hedonistic leisure. The toilet attendants in nightclubs, the drug dealing that occurred in bar toilets and outside venues, and the open discussions of cocaine use among friendship groups all indicated how the drug had become integrated into mainstream recreational culture in ways that distinguished this period from earlier eras, when cocaine remained more confined to subcultural contexts. The powder cocaine that circulated in recreational markets during this period typically arrived through distribution networks, distinct from those supplying crack cocaine to more marginalized populations, with different dealers, different consumption contexts, and different social meanings attached to use, despite both markets ultimately deriving their supplies from the same international cocaine trafficking organizations. The purity of cocaine in British recreational markets during the 2000s varied considerably, but averaged between 20 and 40% cocaine content by weight, with the remainder consisting of various cutting agents, including sugars, local anesthetics, and other adulterants that dealers added to increase profit margins or to mimic expected effects. The health risks associated with recreational cocaine use included cardiovascular effects that could trigger heart attacks or strokes, particularly in individuals with underlying conditions, psychiatric effects, including anxiety and paranoia, and potential for developing dependence, characterized by compulsive use despite negative consequences, though the proportion of recreational users who developed serious problems remained contested, with estimates ranging widely, depending on measurement methods and definitions of problematic use. The first decade of the 21st century witnessed continuing expansion of cocaine markets in Britain, with drug use surveys indicating that powder cocaine had become the second most commonly used illegal drug after cannabis, with prevalence particularly high among young adults aged 16 to 34 living in urban areas. The Crime Survey for England and Wales, which began measuring drug use in 1996 through household surveys of representative samples, documented steady increases in reported lifetime cocaine use, from 1.4% of adults in 1996 to 3% by 2008. Though these figures certainly underestimated true prevalence due to sampling limitations, including exclusion of homeless populations and possible underreporting by survey respondents reluctant to admit illegal behavior. The growth in cocaine use coincided with significant increases in the volume of cocaine seized by British law enforcement agencies, with seizure data suggesting that importation had expanded dramatically despite enforcement efforts, as larger seizures indicated both more successful interdiction and greater overall quantities entering the country that overwhelmed enforcement capacity. The typical wholesale price for kilogram quantities of cocaine in British markets declined during the early 2000s in inflation-adjusted terms, despite increased enforcement pressure, providing economic evidence that supply increases outpaced any enforcement effects on availability. The diversification of trafficking routes and methods reflected criminal organizations' adaptive responses to enforcement pressure, with traffickers utilizing commercial shipping containers, private aircraft, maritime vessels, including both large cargo ships and small speedboats, individual couriers on commercial flights, and postal services to move cocaine from South America and Spain into Britain. The law enforcement emphasis on high-level trafficking organizations and major seizures sometimes had paradoxical effects by creating market opportunities for smaller, independent trafficking groups that could operate below the threshold of intensive investigation, while collectively moving substantial quantities that exceeded what larger organizations could import, despite their greater resources and sophistication. The street-level enforcement of cocaine laws fell disproportionately on working-class and minority populations, while middle-class recreational users faced much lower arrest risks due to consumption occurring in private spaces and social contexts where police presence remained minimal, creating class and racial disparities in who experienced criminal justice consequences, despite evidence that cocaine use occurred across socio-economic and demographic categories. The stop-and-search powers that police used extensively in urban areas with minority populations generated disproportionate arrest rates for drug possession offenses among Black and Asian individuals compared to white individuals, with statistical analyses consistently demonstrating that these disparities could not be explained by differences in drug use rates, and instead reflected both disparate enforcement patterns and possible discriminatory targeting. The sentencing disparities that emerged in British cocaine cases reflected the continuing distinction between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, despite their chemical similarity, with crack offences typically receiving harsher sentences based on judicial perceptions that crack dealing caused greater harm to communities, though critics argued that these disparities reflected class and racial biases rather than objective harm assessments. The development of drug courts and specialized criminal justice interventions during the 2000s represented attempts to divert drug-using offenders from traditional prosecution toward treatment-oriented responses, though the effectiveness of these programs remained contested and their scale insufficient to substantially affect overall criminal justice processing of drug cases. The expansion of drug treatment services during the New Labour period included significant increases in funding for residential rehabilitation programs, community-based treatment services, and substitute prescribing programs, though these expansions focused primarily on opiate users, while cocaine treatment capacity remained underdeveloped, due partly to the absence of pharmacological interventions comparable to methadone for opiate dependence. The evidence base for cocaine treatment effectiveness remained limited compared to opiate treatment, with neither substitute medications nor specific psychosocial interventions demonstrating consistently superior outcomes across diverse patient populations, leading to treatment approaches that combined motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, and mutual support groups in various configurations tailored to individual circumstances. The harm reduction movement in Britain had developed primarily around opiate use and HIV prevention during the 1980s, and expanding these principles to cocaine use required adapting interventions to address the different risk profiles and use patterns characteristic of stimulant drugs, with harm reduction for cocaine focusing on reducing cardiovascular risks, preventing drug interactions, reducing injection-related harms for the minority of users who injected cocaine, and providing accurate information about cutting agents and purity variation in street markets. The period from 2010 through 2020 witnessed significant changes in British cocaine markets, including further normalization of powder cocaine use among recreational populations, persistent crack cocaine problems in disadvantaged urban areas, and emerging concerns about cocaine's impacts on middle-class professionals who had previously been viewed as responsible recreational users. The economic crisis that began in 2008 had complex effects on drug markets, with initial evidence suggesting some reduction in cocaine use due to reduced consumer spending power, but subsequent recovery as drug prices adjusted downward and user priorities adapted to changed economic circumstances. The austerity policies implemented by conservative governments after 2010 significantly reduced funding for drug treatment services, causing closures of residential rehabilitation facilities reductions in staffing for community treatment programs, and lengthening waiting times for individuals seeking help with drug problems. The local authority funding cuts that accompanied national austerity measures disproportionately affected services addressing homelessness, mental health, and social support that formed crucial components of comprehensive responses to problematic drug use, creating situations where individuals struggling with crack cocaine dependence faced reduced access to both specialist drug treatment and broader social services. The development of online drug markets operating through encrypted networks on the dark web created new distribution channels that enabled some users to purchase cocaine with reduced risks of arrest or violence compared to street markets. Though dark web cocaine purchasing remained limited to technologically sophisticated users with access to cryptocurrency and understanding of operational security measures necessary for avoiding detection. The emergence of high-purity cocaine in British recreational markets during the 2010s represented a significant change from the heavily adulterated cocaine typical of earlier periods, with some samples testing above 80% purity compared to the 30 to 40% that had been typical during the 1990s and early 2000s. The increased purity created new health risks, as users accustomed to lower purity cocaine might consume dangerous doses without recognizing the increased potency, with emergency departments reporting cocaine-related overdoses and cardiovascular emergencies that occurred among recreational users who had no intention of consuming excessive amounts. The mixing of cocaine with alcohol remained extremely common among recreational users, despite creating enhanced cardiovascular stress and the production of cocaethylene, a metabolite formed when the liver processes cocaine and alcohol simultaneously, which produces intensified stimulant effects, while also increasing toxicity and cardiovascular risks. The prevalence of cocaine use among successful professionals working in finance, law, media, and other high-status occupations created cognitive dissonance in public discourse as commentators struggled to reconcile continuing harsh penalties for cocaine possession with recognition that substantial numbers of socially instable, integrated and economically productive individuals regularly used the drug without experiencing the severe consequences traditionally associated with drug addiction. The cultural representation of cocaine shifted during this period, with increasing media coverage of middle-class cocaine use, presenting the drug less as a substance that inevitably led to personal destruction, and more as a risky behavior that some people managed without major consequences, while others developed serious problems, paralleling the cultural understandings of alcohol that recognized both controlled social drinking and alcoholism as possible outcomes. The gendered dimensions of cocaine discourse during the 2010s included growing recognition that women used cocaine at rates approaching male use, contradicting earlier assumptions that drug use was predominantly male behavior, with research suggesting that women faced particular barriers to treatment access, including childcare responsibilities, fear of child protection interventions, and services designed primarily for male clients. The intersection of cocaine use with mental health problems received increasing research attention, as clinicians and researchers recognized the high rates of co-occurring conditions, including depression, anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, and ADHD among people using cocaine, with debate continuing about causal relationships between mental health problems and drug use, and about optimal treatment approaches for individuals with both conditions simultaneously. The concept of self-medication suggested that some individuals used cocaine to manage symptoms of mental health conditions, though this interpretation remained contested, and alternative explanations, including direct neurobiological effects of cocaine, triggering psychiatric symptoms, and common underlying risk factors, predisposing individuals to both mental health problems and drug use, received empirical support from different research traditions. The law enforcement landscape for cocaine during the 2010s involved continuing tensions between harm reduction and abstinence-oriented approaches, between criminal justice and public health frameworks, and between national drug strategies and the practical realities of frontline service delivery. The police recorded dramatic increases in drug-related deaths during this period, with deaths involving cocaine rising from 112 in 2011 to 637 in 2019, representing nearly a six-fold increase that generated renewed concerns about the drug's safety and calls for policy responses, ranging from enhanced treatment to further criminalization. The county lines phenomenon that emerged during the mid-2010s involved urban drug dealing operations, establishing distribution networks in smaller towns and rural areas through systems that exploited vulnerable individuals, including children and people with mental health problems or cognitive disabilities, who could be recruited or coerced into drug transportation and dealing roles, with cocaine and heroin representing the primary drugs distributed through these networks. The violence associated with county lines operations included both violence by criminal organizations against rival dealers or individuals who interfered with drug distribution, and violence experienced by vulnerable individuals exploited within these networks who faced punishment if they failed to follow instructions or if drugs or money went missing. The law enforcement response to county lines emphasized disrupting the criminal networks through prosecutions of organizers, while attempting to support victims exploited within these operations, though the effectiveness of this approach remained contested, given the ready supply of vulnerable individuals available for recruitment and the continuing demand for drugs in towns where county lines operated. The international dimensions of cocaine supply continued to evolve during the 2010s, with record-high cocaine production in Colombia, driven by factors including increased coca cultivation, improved processing efficiency, and the displacement of production into remote areas following the partial demobilization of FARC guerrillas, who had controlled cocaine production in some regions. The Brexit referendum in 2016 and Britain's subsequent departure from the European Union created potential changes to drug enforcement cooperation with European partners, with concerns that reduced information sharing and coordination could benefit trafficking organizations, though the practical impacts remained unclear, as many bilateral cooperation arrangements continued despite Brexit. The legalization and decriminalization debates that intensified in Britain during the 2010s reflected frustration with the limited effectiveness of criminalization, growing recognition of the social costs of criminal justice approaches, including mass incarceration and criminalization of minority communities, and international examples, including Portugal's decriminalization model and various cannabis legalization initiatives that challenged prohibitionist orthodoxy. The question of whether Britain should move toward decriminalization or legalization of currently illegal drugs became more politically viable during this period, though it remained controversial, with supporters arguing that regulated legal markets could reduce harm while opponents maintained that legalization would increase use and cause greater overall damage to public health. The specific question of cocaine policy reform involved particular challenges given the drug's higher risk profile compared to cannabis, with few advocates suggesting full commercial legalization comparable to alcohol, though some supported decriminalization that would treat possession as a civil violation rather than criminal offense. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Drug Policy Reform published reports during the 2010s advocating for fundamental reconsideration of British drug policy, including exploration of decriminalization and legal regulation options, representing mainstream political engagement with reform ideas that had previously been confined to activist groups and academic researchers. The professional bodies representing health practitioners generally supported moves toward treating drug use primarily as a health issue rather than a criminal matter, with organizations including the Royal College of Physicians and the Faculty of Public Health endorsing approaches that prioritize treatment and harm reduction over criminal sanctions. The police perspectives on drug policy reflected diverse views ranging from support for continuing criminal enforcement as essential for protecting communities to recognition that enforcement alone could not solve drug problems, and that different approaches might achieve better outcomes with less harm, with some former police officers who had implemented drug laws becoming advocates for reform after concluding that prohibition created more problems than it solved. The COVID-19 pandemic that began affecting Britain in early 2020 created significant disruptions to cocaine markets and drug policy implementation through impacts on international trafficking routes, domestic distribution networks, treatment service provision, and enforcement priorities. The international travel restrictions and border controls implemented to slow viral transmission created obstacles for drug trafficking operations that relied on commercial air travel for courier-based smuggling. Though criminal organizations adapted by shifting toward maritime and overland routes, less affected by pandemic restrictions. The domestic distribution of cocaine faced challenges during lockdown periods when movement restrictions limited dealers' ability to operate openly, while users faced difficulties obtaining drugs through normal channels, leading to innovations including increased use of delivery services and greater reliance on digital communication for arranging transactions. The closure of nightclubs and entertainment venues eliminated major contexts for recreational cocaine use, potentially reducing overall consumption among some user populations, while others shifted drug use to private settings, including home consumption that continued despite pandemic restrictions. The drug treatment sector experienced severe disruptions as residential facilities implemented infection control measures that reduced capacity, while community services shifted to remote delivery through telephone and video consultations that worked well for some clients, but created difficulties for others who required in-person support or who lacked stable housing or technology access for engaging with remote services. The increase in drug-related deaths during 2020, which reached record levels for cocaine deaths, reflected multiple pandemic impacts, including disrupted treatment access, increased social isolation that removed protective factors, greater risk-taking by users experiencing mental health deterioration, and possible changes in cocaine purity or adulterant patterns as supply chains adapted to pandemic disruptions. The economic impacts of pandemic lockdowns and subsequent recovery created financial stress that affected both cocaine use patterns and participation in drug distribution, with some individuals reducing consumption due to limited income, while others engaged in cocaine dealing as an alternative income source when legitimate employment became scarce. The law enforcement priorities during the pandemic shifted toward preventing large gatherings and enforcing lockdown rules, rather than pursuing traditional drug enforcement, creating circumstances where cocaine dealing occurred with reduced police interference in some areas, while other locations witnessed intensive enforcement that used drug laws as tools for general order maintenance. The broader social impacts of the pandemic, including increased mental health problems, social isolation, domestic violence, and economic insecurity, created conditions that made problematic cocaine use more likely, while simultaneously reducing the protective factors and support systems that typically helped individuals avoid developing serious drug problems or assisted recovery for those who did develop dependence. The long-term implications of pandemic disruptions for British cocaine markets and drug policy remained uncertain as of 2021, though early evidence suggested that markets had largely adapted to pandemic conditions and that cocaine availability had returned to pre-pandemic levels. As trafficking organizations developed new smuggling methods and distribution, networks adjusted to changed circumstances. The question of whether pandemic-related shifts in drug policy, including greater tolerance for treatment service, flexibility, and reduced emphasis on criminal justice responses, would persist after the immediate public health emergency subsided, remained open, with competing pressures from reform advocates seeking to institutionalize adaptive changes and traditionalists arguing for returning to pre-pandemic enforcement approaches. The broader transformation of British society that occurred during the first 2 decades of the 21st century included significant changes in cultural attitudes toward drug use, with younger generations generally expressing more tolerant views toward recreational drug use, including cocaine, while older generations maintained more prohibitionist perspectives, suggesting that British drug policy might shift in more liberal directions, as demographic change gradually altered the composition of the electorate and policy-making bodies. The contemporary cocaine situation in Britain, as of the early 2020s, reflects the accumulated consequences of decisions made throughout the substance's long history in the country. From the initial enthusiastic medical adoption during the Victorian period, through the increasing restrictions of the 20th century, to the current situation characterized by widespread recreational use among certain populations, persistent crack cocaine problems in disadvantaged areas, substantial criminal justice costs, and limited treatment capacity relative to the scale of problematic use. The prevalence data from surveys conducted during the early 2020s suggest that powder cocaine has become thoroughly embedded in British recreational drug culture, with approximately 9% of adults aged 16 to 59 reporting lifetime cocaine use and approximately 2% reporting use in the past year, according to Crime Survey for England and Wales data, making cocaine the second most commonly used illegal drug after cannabis. The geographical distribution of cocaine use shows highest prevalence in London and other major urban centres, with lower rates in rural areas and smaller towns. Though the county lines phenomenon has extended cocaine availability into areas that previously had limited local markets, the demographic patterns of cocaine use continue to show highest rates among young adults in their 20s and 30s, with use declining significantly among older age groups, while gender differences have narrowed considerably from earlier periods when male use substantially exceeded female use. The socio-economic distribution of cocaine use varies by type, with powder cocaine showing relatively flat distribution across social classes, or even higher prevalence among professional and managerial occupations, while crack cocaine use remains concentrated among the most disadvantaged populations, including homeless individuals, those involved in street-based sex work, and people with severe mental health and social problems. The health consequences of current cocaine use patterns include the cardiovascular deaths that have increased substantially during recent years, psychiatric effects, including cocaine-induced psychosis, the impacts of chronic use on cognitive function and emotional regulation, and the social consequences, including relationship problems, employment difficulties, and financial stress resulting from both direct costs of cocaine purchase and indirect consequences of use. The criminal justice costs of cocaine enforcement include the expenses of policing, prosecution, and incarceration for the tens of thousands of individuals arrested annually for cocaine offences, with possession arrests vastly outnumbering supply arrests, and with young men from disadvantaged backgrounds disproportionately represented among those receiving criminal sanctions. The broader economic costs of cocaine problems include lost productivity from individuals whose use interferes with employment, healthcare costs for treating cocaine-related medical and psychiatric conditions, social welfare costs for supporting individuals whose drug problems contribute to unemployment and homelessness, and the substantial costs of drug treatment services. The international dimensions of British cocaine policy include participation in United Nations drug control conventions that require domestic criminalization of cocaine production, distribution, and use, involvement in international law enforcement cooperation, targeting major trafficking organizations, and engagement with source countries in South America on programs aimed at reducing coca cultivation and cocaine production. The question of whether current British cocaine policy achieves appropriate balances between competing objectives, including protecting public health, reducing crime, respecting individual liberty, and minimizing social costs, has generated continuing debate among policymakers, researchers, healthcare providers, law enforcement officials, and affected communities, with no clear consensus emerging about whether current approaches should be maintained, whether modifications within existing frameworks could improve outcomes, or whether fundamental policy transformation, including decriminalization or legalization, deserves serious consideration. The harm reduction movement's arguments for pragmatic approaches that prioritize reducing negative consequences over eliminating drug use entirely have gained substantial support within public health communities, though implementation of harm reduction principles for cocaine has lagged behind their application to opiate use due to both technical challenges in developing effective interventions for stimulant drugs and political resistance to approaches that acknowledge some cocaine use will continue regardless of policies. The treatment field's understanding of cocaine dependence has advanced significantly from the early days, when cocaine was viewed primarily through moral frameworks, emphasizing weakness of will, with contemporary neurobiological research demonstrating how cocaine affects brain reward systems and creates persistent changes that contribute to compulsive use, though translating this scientific knowledge into more effective treatments has has proven challenging. The pharmaceutical industry's efforts to develop medications that could assist cocaine dependence treatment have not yet produced approved drugs comparable to methadone or buprenorphine for opiate dependence. Though research continues on various approaches, including vaccines that could prevent cocaine from reaching the brain, medications that might reduce craving, and drugs that could restore normal functioning to brain systems disrupted by chronic cocaine use. The social context of cocaine use in contemporary Britain reflects the substance's complex position in culture, with powder cocaine functioning as a normalized party drug among certain populations, while simultaneously remaining strongly stigmatized in other social contexts, and with crack cocaine bearing particularly heavy stigma that affects how users are perceived and treated by social services, healthcare systems, and criminal justice institutions. The cultural representation of cocaine in British media, popular culture, and public discourse has evolved from earlier periods when drug users were uniformly depicted as dangerous criminals or pitiable addicts to more nuanced portrayals that recognize diverse patterns of use and varied consequences, though moral panic narratives that emphasize worst-case outcomes and associate drug use with crime and social disorder continue to influence policy debates. The class dimensions of contemporary British cocaine discourse reflect the tension between the middle-class recreational users, who constitute a substantial portion of the powder cocaine market, and working-class crack users, who both bear disproportionate criminal justice consequences and social stigma, with this bifurcation raising questions about whether policy approaches serve to reinforce class hierarchies and whether the different treatment of chemically similar substances reflects rational harm assessment or class prejudice. The racial elements of British cocaine policy and enforcement show continuing patterns of disparate impact despite the absence of explicit racial targeting in official policies, with black individuals significantly overrepresented among those arrested and incarcerated for crack cocaine offences, while white middle-class powder cocaine users largely avoid criminal justice consequences, creating racial inequalities that undermine claims that drug policy operates neutrally across demographic groups. The gender aspects of contemporary cocaine use include recognition that women face particular vulnerabilities, including higher rates of sexual victimization among women using crack cocaine, greater stigma for drug use among pregnant women and mothers, and treatment systems that often fail to address women's specific needs, including trauma, childcare responsibilities, and pregnancy-related concerns. The intersection of cocaine use with other social problems, including homelessness, mental illness, involvement in sex work, and criminal justice system contact, creates complex situations where multiple disadvantages compound each other, and where interventions addressing only drug use prove insufficient without also addressing the broader constellation of problems affecting individuals' lives. The debate over abstinence-oriented versus harm reduction approaches continues to divide drug treatment philosophy, with 12-step programs and therapeutic communities emphasizing complete abstinence from all drugs as the only acceptable goal, while harm reduction approaches accept that some individuals may continue using drugs while working on reducing negative consequences and improving other aspects of their lives. The evidence base for different treatment approaches remains contested, with methodological challenges, including high rates of treatment dropout, difficulties with follow-up assessment, and problems defining treatment success, making it difficult to determine which interventions produce the best outcomes for which populations under what circumstances. The role of mutual support groups, including Cocaine Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, in providing peer support for individuals seeking to stop using cocaine, has been significant for many people, though these groups' effectiveness remains difficult to evaluate systematically given their anonymous nature and lack of formal record keeping. The family impacts of cocaine problems extend beyond individual users to affect partners, children, and parents who experience emotional distress, financial problems, relationship damage, and in some cases exposure to violence or criminal justice involvement as consequences of a family member's cocaine use. The intergenerational dimensions of drug problems include the increased vulnerability to substance use among children of parents who use drugs, reflecting both potential genetic predispositions and environmental influences, including exposure to drug use, family disruption, trauma, and socioeconomic disadvantage that create elevated risk for developing drug problems in subsequent generations. The public health approach to cocaine that has gained increasing support among health professionals and some policymakers emphasizes treating drug use primarily as a health issue, requiring medical and social interventions rather than criminal sanctions, with advocates arguing that this approach could reduce stigma, increase treatment engagement, lower criminal justice costs, and achieve better outcomes for individuals and communities. The practical implementation of public health approaches faces significant obstacles, including the international treaty framework, requiring criminalization, domestic political resistance to approaches that might be characterized as soft on drugs, concerns about whether decriminalization could increase use by removing deterrent effects, and questions about how to structure health-focused responses to ensure adequate access to effective interventions. The Portuguese decriminalization model, implemented in 2001, has attracted substantial international attention as a potential template for reform, with Portugal eliminating criminal penalties for drug possession while maintaining civil sanctions and referral to commissions for dissuasion of drug addiction that assess users and can recommend treatment or impose administrative penalties. Though debate continues about whether Portugal's experience translates to other contexts with different social conditions and drug markets. The question of whether the evidence from Portugal and other jurisdictions that have implemented drug policy reforms supports broader adoption of decriminalization approaches remains contested, with supporters highlighting reductions in problematic use, drug-related deaths, HIV transmission, and incarceration, while critics question causal attribution and argue that other factors explain observed changes. The specific challenges of applying decriminalization to cocaine differ from those involving cannabis, given cocaine's greater harm potential, and the absence of the medical marijuana movement that created political support for cannabis. Policy reform. Making cocaine policy change politically more difficult, despite some of the same arguments about criminal justice, costs, and racial disparities, applying with equal or greater force. The economic analysis of drug policy increasingly focuses on cost-effectiveness comparisons between enforcement and treatment, with research generally suggesting that treatment investments produce greater social benefits per pound spent than criminal justice interventions, though these findings have not yet translated into proportional resource allocation, as enforcement continues to receive substantially more funding than treatment in most jurisdictions. The tension between evidence-based policy and political considerations remains central to drug policy debates, with substantial research suggesting that current approaches do not effectively reduce drug use, impose large social costs, and generate racial and class disparities. Yet political constraints limit the feasibility of fundamental reform, regardless of evidence. The role of moral values and philosophical assumptions about individual autonomy, state authority, and social responsibility in shaping drug policy preferences means that empirical evidence alone cannot resolve policy debates, as people with different value commitments can interpret the same evidence differently or prioritize different outcomes when evaluating policy effectiveness. The question of whether individuals have fundamental rights to use drugs that should be protected against state interference, even when drug use causes personal harm, reflects libertarian perspectives that clash with both traditional, conservative moralism and progressive public health paternalism, creating unusual ideological alignments, where both left and right include both supporters and opponents of drug liberalization, depending on which values they prioritize. The utilitarian calculus of weighing the harms of drug use against the harms of drug prohibition becomes complex when considering that prohibition's harms fall heavily on particular populations, including racial minorities and the poor, while potential increases in drug use from legalization might affect broader populations, raising difficult questions about how to weigh unequal distributions of costs and benefits across social groups. The future trajectory of British cocaine policy remains uncertain, as multiple factors, including demographic change, evolving cultural attitudes, continuing problems with current approaches, international reform examples, and broader changes in British society and politics, create both pressures for change and resistance to reform. The generational differences in attitudes toward drug use suggest that the political constituency for maintaining strict prohibition may decline as older generations, with more conservative views, are replaced by younger cohorts more comfortable with drug policy reform. Though the pace and direction of change remain unpredictable, the potential for technological innovations to affect cocaine markets includes both developments that could facilitate use, such as more sophisticated drug testing equipment, enabling users to assess purity and detect dangerous adulterants, and innovations that could support enforcement, including improved detection technologies and data analytics for identifying trafficking networks. The cryptocurrency and dark web technology that has enabled online drug markets may continue to evolve in ways that make it easier for users to obtain cocaine, with reduced risks compared to street markets, potentially shifting drug distribution toward online channels that pose different regulatory challenges than traditional enforcement approaches were designed to address. The question of whether synthetic drugs that could replicate cocaine's effects might be developed, and how such substances would be regulated, reflects broader challenges in drug policy, as pharmaceutical chemistry advances faster than regulatory frameworks can adapt, creating situations where new psychoactive substances appear faster than authorities can assess their risks and implement controls. The climate change impacts on coca cultivation in South America could affect global cocaine supply if changing weather patterns, temperature shifts, or altered precipitation regimes make traditional growing areas less suitable for coca production. Though the crop's adaptability and growers' potential responses, including moving cultivation to new areas, make the ultimate supply impacts uncertain. The political instability and state weakness in some cocaine-source countries creates continuing challenges for supply-side drug control strategies, as weak governance enables trafficking organizations to operate with limited interference, while simultaneously making it difficult to implement alternative development programs or institution-building initiatives that might reduce countries' reliance on cocaine production. The continuing evolution of organized crime structures involved in cocaine trafficking includes both the fragmentation of major cartels that had dominated the trade during earlier periods and the emergence of more decentralized networks that may be more resilient to enforcement disruption, but also more likely to engage in violence due to reduced hierarchical control. The European dimension of British cocaine policy has become more complex following Brexit, with questions about the future of law enforcement cooperation, information sharing, and coordinated enforcement operations, requiring new bilateral agreements and practical arrangements to replace the frameworks that existed within the European Union. The post-Brexit British position on international drug policy may evolve as the country develops independent foreign policy positions no longer constrained by European Union collective decision-making, potentially creating opportunities for more flexible approaches, or alternatively, leading to more rigid positions depending on the political priorities of different governments. The domestic political dynamics of drug policy reform face significant obstacles, including opposition from law enforcement organizations with institutional interests in maintaining current arrangements, conservative politicians and media outlets that benefit from tough-on-crime positioning, and public opinion that remains divided about appropriate responses to drug problems despite growing support for emphasizing treatment over punishment. The role of evidence and expertise in drug policy decision-making remains contested, as politicians must balance technical considerations from researchers and practitioners against political factors, including public opinion, interest group pressures, and ideological commitments that may conflict with evidence-based recommendations. The broader context within which British cocaine policy operates includes the global drug control regime established through United Nations conventions, the bilateral relationships with drug-producing and transit countries, the domestic political economy of drug enforcement and treatment, and the cultural meanings attached to drugs and drug use that shape how problems are understood and what responses seem appropriate. The international drug control system faces fundamental challenges, including the difficulty of preventing drug production in source countries, where coca cultivation provides economic opportunities for rural populations with limited alternatives, the virtual impossibility of interdicting more than a small fraction of drugs flowing through global commerce and transportation systems, and the adaptability of trafficking organizations that adjust routes and methods to circumvent enforcement efforts. The question of whether the international community should continue pursuing supply reduction as a primary strategy or shift toward emphasizing demand reduction through prevention and treatment has been debated for decades without reaching consensus, as countries have different interests and perspectives based on whether they are primarily source, transit, or consumption countries. The reform of international drug treaties to allow greater national flexibility in determining drug policies faces obstacles, including the requirement for consensus among states, parties, and opposition from countries with more prohibitionist orientations who view treaty modifications as dangerous capitulation to drug interests. The competing narratives about drugs and drug policy include the disease model, emphasizing addiction as a chronic brain disorder requiring medical treatment, the moral model viewing drug use as a character flaw requiring punishment and rehabilitation, the social model focusing on socio-economic conditions that create vulnerability to drug problems, and the libertarian model emphasizing individual freedom to make choices about drug use without state interference. The tension between these different frameworks means that drug policy debates often involve participants talking past each other because they begin from incompatible assumptions about what drugs problems are and what responses would be appropriate. The medicalization of drug problems, through increasing emphasis on addiction as disease, has had mixed effects, reducing stigma and supporting treatment approaches while potentially obscuring the social determinants of drug problems and individualizing what are partly structural issues. The criminalization of drug use and low-level dealing has created massive inequalities in who experiences criminal justice sanctions, with enforcement falling disproportionately on poor and minority communities, while middle-class users avoid contact with criminal justice systems, raising fundamental questions about whether drug laws can be applied equitably or whether criminalization inherently produces unequal impacts. The economic costs of enforcing drug laws, including police time, court processing, incarceration expenses, and criminal records that impair future employment prospects, create substantial social burdens that some analysts argue exceed the costs that drug use itself imposes on society. The violence associated with illegal drug markets results primarily from prohibition rather than from pharmacological effects of drugs, as dealers cannot resolve disputes through legal mechanisms and must instead use violence to enforce contracts, protect territory, and maintain reputations, while drug debts provide motivation for property crime and other offences. The question of what cocaine policy would best serve British society's interests involves value judgments about which outcomes matter most, empirical questions about which policies produce what effects, and political considerations about what changes are feasible given existing institutions and public opinion. The evidence from decades of experience with criminalization suggests that this approach has not prevented substantial drug use, has imposed significant social costs, including mass incarceration and criminalization of minority communities, has generated enormous profits for criminal organizations that corrupt governments and destabilize communities, and has not clearly produced better public health outcomes than less punitive approaches. The alternative approaches, including decriminalization, medical prescription models, and various forms of legalization with regulation, present different trade-offs between personal liberty, public health, crime reduction, and revenue generation, with no option eliminating all problems and each creating new challenges while addressing problems with current arrangements. The Portuguese decriminalization model has demonstrated that removing criminal penalties for personal drug possession does not lead to dramatic increases in use and can reduce some harms, including drug-related deaths and HIV transmission, though questions remain about whether the treatment referral system functions effectively and whether the model could be implemented successfully in countries with different institutional capacities and cultural contexts. The medical prescription models used in Switzerland, the Netherlands, and some other countries that provide heroin or cocaine to dependent users who have not benefited from conventional treatment show promise for reducing crime, improving health, and enabling social reintegration for chronic users. Though these approaches remain politically controversial and require significant clinical infrastructure, the various cannabis legalization initiatives implemented in North American jurisdictions provide some evidence about how legalization with commercial regulation functions in practice, showing that legal markets can substantially reduce criminal justice costs while generating tax revenue, but also creating new regulatory challenges around preventing youth access, impaired driving, and ensuring product safety. The question of whether lessons from cannabis legalization apply to cocaine involves both pharmacological considerations about different drugs' risk profiles and political considerations about whether public support for reform extends beyond cannabis to drugs perceived as more dangerous. The fundamental challenge in drug policy is that no approach eliminates all problems, while all approaches create some difficulties, requiring difficult trade-offs between competing objectives, including minimizing health harms, respecting individual liberty, reducing crime, generating revenue, and protecting youth. The history of cocaine in Britain demonstrates how drug problems and policy responses evolve over time in response to changing scientific knowledge, cultural attitudes, political priorities, and international influences, with current situations reflecting accumulated consequences of past decisions that create path dependencies, limiting what changes are possible while also creating pressures for reform when existing approaches prove inadequate. The substance that arrived in Britain during the Victorian era as an exciting medical innovation has travelled a long and complex path through acceptance, restriction, and contested contemporary status as both a recreational drug embedded in mainstream social scenes and a source of significant individual and social harm, requiring thoughtful responses that balance multiple considerations. The challenge of developing drug policy that protects public health without creating excessive criminal justice burdens, that respects individual autonomy while preventing harm to others, and that addresses the root causes of problematic drug use, including social inequality and limited opportunity, remains as pressing today as at any point in British history, requiring continued engagement with difficult questions about the appropriate relationship between individual liberty and collective well-being in a diverse and changing society.